but that just be like, it can be case by case, but still having that consistency, and also continuing to be concise in general as it relates to your product and your audience is just really going to clearly, give that messaging and what you want people to do, like just really be able to clarify that so people don't have any question whatsoever when they move forward. So, so we talked about some descriptions, and I love how again, like you just bring up the topic of making it accessible, having that accessible language, because it's sometimes we just don't think about that as being a potential issue, but it's a big one as we identify. But moving along in terms of messaging, another one that we mentioned is just a visual form of messaging. So like, what are some things that you've come across, if any, off the top of your head, in ways that you've seen messaging, visual messaging? And again, we're talking about media assets here, so videos and images, screenshots. But have you ever come across any that you're kind of like, okay, what am I looking at here?
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the examples that come to mind are from companies big enough where, like, their messaging almost matters a lot less. But, like, for visual assets, for example, I think of kind of the infamous example of, it was for a movie. It was for Spider-Man Homecoming. And I don't know if it was, like, a poster or what, but it had, like, Spider-Man in the suit, and then like Iron Man flying next to him, and then Peter Parker in the background without the mask, and then Tony kind of standing behind him. It was just a very noisy image that didn't really do anything to convey like what the movie was about. But of course, it was from one of the largest, most lucrative film franchises in the world, so nobody really cared. But
They're like, Spider-Man movie, yay!
Yeah, exactly. Trying to think a little bit closer to home. Good thing is, I guess, for a lot of the indies that I've played recently, I can't really think of examples where visual media wasn't adequately conveying what they were going for. So I think to kind of go on the opposite end of the spectrum, some things that I think were exceptionally well handled in way of visual assets. Fall Guys has like some of the best like pre-rendered content out there. Like every video they release is so much more like in the spirit of the game than it is, say, a one-to-one translation of how the game actually looks and plays. Like they have their characters do simple things like emote more in their videos and stuff like that to kind of show the like competitive, friendly, fun nature of the game. I think Among Us is another great example. A lot of their visual media is like very comical in nature, even though the game is set in kind of these like perilous situations. It's obviously intended, especially now, to be very widely accessible, and so there's a lot of like comedy to their visual assets, and I'm sure there's a whole lot that goes into that because I know Victoria is kind of doing a lot of their community management stuff now, or communications directing stuff rather.
Yeah.
But yeah, like those are some examples I think are really strong.
Yeah, and that's I like how you mentioned that too, because it is a somewhat different approach in terms of form of messaging, like. Because in that, it's not necessarily like in some of those images and stuff that I'm like somewhat recalling in my head right now. It may not necessarily be a direct relation to the product in terms of like specifics, right? Because as you said, it's a lot of like humor oriented, even though it's a bit, but because that's overall kind of the overall like tone that game has been setting is more humor related, because of like the audience's reaction and things like that. So that form of messaging is really important, I think, because it helps convey maybe more of the experience and mood. Than like, because if you were to say what actually happens in the game, like a quick, short description, it might not necessarily represent what the experience is really like or how the experience has formed and become, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of like an involved one. So it's interesting. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because it's one that we probably don't look at maybe too often, or we just look at it and kind of like think of it as like the norm to some degree, because we're already familiar with it. Now, another way I like to look at it too, in different ways I look at this, in terms of areas where I feel that imagery can be kind of convoluted, kind of to a degree, especially when it comes to like video is a little bit better in terms of providing that context, in terms of like gameplay and things like that. But when you get a screenshot, sometimes you could be completely lost. And where I see this the most, it could be anywhere, honestly, but where I see this the most is Twitter. And understandably so. People grab a screenshot, put it up. You can sometimes see it in Steam too. And people are just trying to populate those areas and show progress, whatever, promote. They're just trying to get it out there. But what I see happen sometimes in terms of how the messaging and the visual messaging is conveyed is people might not. They think more of the task or executing the task opposed to what is going to be, how is that conveyed, or what is the interpretation of that image. And what I mean specifically is, and I know from firsthand, because I've had my share of trying to get screenshots for clients too, where if you take a screenshot, you're like, okay, we need a screenshot of this new level that we're showcasing. Great. And you grab it and throw it out there. But if you really look at it, just because the goal is to show the new level, but what's happening? Does it look like in the image? Because I've taken hundreds of images before, or where I'm like, wow, all these look like nothing is going on and it's just not interesting or whatever. So I've actually, and some of you are probably already familiar with this, but I actually had to I didn't have the control that some game developers may have with their games, where you go in and set the perfect ideal situation to make something look awesome, but you would never put a player in that actual scenario of gameplay, because it would just be brutally cruel, probably. But so what I'm talking about specifically, I was doing one where there was a character going in. It showed the level, but what it didn't show was like any engagement. Were there lasers flying around? Like what type of other things were going on? And the more that you could show with that, or to convey what is really going on in the single image, the better that image could convey to people what is going on. Because I think what also happens too, when people don't think about that process and step, and it's work, I'm not going to lie, it's definitely work, is they rely on, hey, let's get the image and then we'll provide text to go along with that. Now that is perfectly fine. However, one, like we're talking about today, is really clarifying that message. And so if you're not doing that, now you have, let's say, an image that's not very clear, and then you have a copy that's not necessarily clear, then, wow, people may really not know what's going on, what's your game about, etc. But even if you provide clear messaging, who knows at what state of mind people are going to be seeing that image. They might not even read the text that you have going with it. So if you're using imagery, you really want to make sure it's as clear as it possibly can, because that's going to be the thing, in most cases, I would assume, that people gravitate towards opposed to the text. So if all those things, and you need to make sure that they kind of align with each other. Because sometimes I see on Twitter, for example, people will post, say, hey, we did this or whatever. And at least they provide context where it's like, hey, we don't have an update, but we at least wanted to share this, right? That, whatever, that is what it is. But sometimes they'll say one thing, and then the image looks like it's showing something completely different. Now, in my head, that's causing confusion. Now I'm trying to think of, okay, what's really going on? And if I'm tired and my brain is like, you know what, you don't really want to focus too much on this because you got other things you got to worry about, I'm just going to pass right through it. And that's what it really comes down to. I think having those good, clear, and doing what you can to clarifying your visual assets in that sense, making sure that when people look at it, they know exactly what the image is conveying, what it represents, of your gameplay. And it's tricky. It can be, like I said, a lot of work, but it's still very important. I know that was a lot of talk about a screenshot, but
hey, screenshots are important, and like you said, sometimes we capture things that are exciting to us because we know what it took to get there. But for a player, they're probably just going to see what's actually in front of them.
Yeah,
Because they don't have the context of your development history with whatever screenshot you're taking.
It's just like anything that you have ever done. Like, have you ever like created reports for work, or you had to present something, whatever? You put all this time and energy in it, and then in the end, it's like I remember some agencies I worked for. Like, there was times that it would take me hours to put together some reports for certain slides, but the presentation that the company was giving to this organization, they only had a time limit of maybe like 5 minutes, where each slide could have taken me an hour or two to put together. Because of getting all the data and information stuff. But that's an extreme example, but that's kind of to the point. Because again, like in those types of situations, you need to clearly provide information in a short format, even though it might take you a little bit extra time. But in a lot of cases, it's definitely worth it. I'll go off a quick tangent. I met with a friend recently, and he's an engineer. I don't know exactly what the company's for, but he's basically designing systems to cool off like servers, okay? But the people who are in charge, they know nothing what goes on, or the mechanics or the engineering that goes behind it. They just want to know, like, what is it going to do and what's the bottom line, right? So he had to put together something that, like, almost in a way, a very advanced or somewhat different form of technology than it currently exists to do the thing they need to do. Cool off these servers, because cooling them off, less time for them to, age and die or whatever, saving money. So basically how we described it is this new form of technology was basically, you could describe any cooling mechanism whatsoever that already exists. In numerous cases, but in their eyes, they're like, "Oh wow, that's really cool that it does that. We like it." And then when they start presenting other things in their thing, what they're basically doing is giving the information to people, and then because it's aligning with what they're capable of understanding and accepting, then they can now start conversation. So his goals and objectives can be met for projects that he wants to do, because he conveyed it in a way that other people understand, and the people that are the ones that will greenlight projects like that, he conveyed it in a format that they understood. So taking this back to games, what does that mean? Again, simplifying things so people understand what you want them to do, what you're trying to show them, so then they now have the information in as simple format as possible to say, yeah, I like that game. I'm going to go wishlist it. I'm going to go buy it, whatever the case is. And that's really what it comes down to, and why it's simplification. So like I said, that was a tangent, but it's just giving another example on why the importance of simplifying things, even if it's to the point where you're like, wow, these people aren't that smart, but that's okay. And it's not a matter of smart. It's more of a matter of time, energy, resources people have when they're looking at your stuff. So you want to make sure it's super short and sweet, so they're not questioning what they're looking at, that they know. Okay, so we're coming close on time here, so I want to start wrapping up with some other conversations. Like, we talked about the importance, essentially, and the types to a good amount of detail with how to make messaging clear, with messaging, the importance and everything. But what are some ways that we can share with people how to make messaging clearer? So with that said, Mustapha, what are some good places to start to really help clarifying your messaging?
Yeah, well, the best place to start is the beginning. Go back to what you've already done and review that. It's revising is a constant process. It's not something you just do and then it's done. You kind of work on it iteratively as much as you possibly can. So go back, review your previous messaging, and then another thing is, of course, to look at those who have done it before. We provided an example with Supergiant. It's worth looking at studios you like and seeing how they do their branding, where the consistencies are. What are words that you see in common across disparate projects that they've done? all sorts of things that you can review to determine how these other companies and other studios and everything